Nobody expected Chuck Norris to slam on his brakes in the middle of a bustling avenue, but that is exactly what he did on an otherwise ordinary afternoon when a faint melody caught his attention. The sun beat down on the busy street where cars honked impatiently, yet Chuck abruptly stopped and tilted his head as if he needed absolute silence to truly hear the music. People behind him started shouting in frustration, but the tension only made Chuck lean forward even more, listening with unwavering focus. The street performer had a ragged guitar slung over his shoulder, and his weary fingers danced across the strings. The man's voice trembled as he sang, clearly pushing through exhaustion. Chuck couldn't ignore the earnestness in every syllable. Therefore, he put his truck in park and signaled for the traffic to wait. People gawking from their car windows soon realized they were witnessing something surreal. Chuck Norris, known for unstoppable energy and unyielding determination, now pressed pause on the frantic pace of daily life because of a single street musician. Word spread along the line of halted vehicles. Baffled drivers hopped out of their cars to see what was happening. Pedestrians on the sidewalk leaned toward the unexpected scene. A few people pulled out their phones and started filming. Nobody understood why Chuck felt so compelled to stop, but he stood there with unwavering concentration, arms folded as though he might stay there all day. The performer, a man in his late 20s named Jeremy, wore faded jeans and a torn jacket that had seen better days. His expression flickered between confusion and hope when he noticed Chuck Norris standing just feet away. Jeremy kept singing because he didn't know what else to do. He watched Chuck's expression shift from curiosity to admiration. Chuck nodded in time with the rhythm, sensing something extraordinary in the raw talent Jeremy displayed. When the last note hung in the heavy summer air, Chuck stepped forward and dropped a bill into the open guitar case. His gesture wasn't ostentatious, but the onlookers gasped at the sight of him reaching to shake Jeremy's hand. Jeremy stammered a polite thank you, and Chuck leaned in close, asking how long Jeremy had been playing. There was a hushed pause as the crowd inched closer, desperate to catch every word. Jeremy explained that he had traveled from a small town with dreams of making it big but found himself scraping by day to day, singing on street corners for loose change. He never anticipated that Chuck Norris would appear out of nowhere, stopping traffic to listen. Chuck offered him a gentle smile, but he didn't linger for long. He promised he would be in touch, then he climbed back into his truck. Traffic started moving again, horns honked in relief or amazement, and the day continued with a strange buzz of excitement. The video capturing Chuck's sudden act of kindness quickly went viral on social media. People commented on how surreal it was to see a celebrity interrupt city life for a humble street performer. Articles popped up, speculating about Chuck's motives. Some folks joked that if Chuck Norris stopped traffic, there must be a deeper reason. Others focused on Jeremy's soulful performance, praising his talent. Chuck stayed quiet throughout the public chatter, choosing to reach out to Jeremy behind the scenes. Therefore, that same evening, Chuck used some of his industry connections to call a longtime acquaintance who had ties to the music business. He recounted the chance encounter, describing how Jeremy's voice resonated like a hidden gem, and how his music carried echoes of genuine pain mixed with unbreakable hope. The acquaintance agreed to meet Jeremy. Within days, a plan was hatched to invite him for a private audition. Chuck felt a surge of satisfaction knowing that he might be opening a door for someone who deserved a shot at a better life. Meanwhile, Jeremy continued his usual routine of playing at various corners, under awnings, outside coffee shops, never dreaming that Chuck Norris had already set in motion a chain of events that could change everything. But the word on the street traveled fast. Strangers approached Jeremy, telling him they had seen the viral video, asking if Chuck had followed through on any promises. Jeremy simply shrugged with a nervous laugh, because nothing had happened yet, and he couldn't let himself believe that a celebrity would actually remember a struggling musician. Then one evening, as Jeremy was packing up his battered guitar, a black sedan pulled up beside him. A man in a neat suit stepped out, introduced himself as an associate of Chuck Norris, and politely invited Jeremy to come for a meeting at a local music studio. Jeremy's eyes widened in disbelief. He stammered that he had no idea Chuck was serious. The associate smiled and handed him a business card, asking him to show up the following afternoon. Jeremy felt his heart race as he watched the sedan drive away, leaving him trembling with anticipation. That night he barely slept. He paced around the cramped motel room where he lived, wondering if this was some elaborate prank. He practiced a few riffs on his guitar, but every chord seemed to waver under the weight of his nerves. At dawn, he prepared for the day with shaky resolve, repeating that he must seize any opportunity no matter how uncertain. Therefore, he arrived at the studio early, racked with anxiety as he stepped into a polished lobby decorated with framed album covers. Soft music played over hidden speakers, and behind a pane of glass sat a receptionist who directed him to wait. Jeremy clutched his guitar case as though it might slip away if he loosened his grip. Suddenly the door opened, and Chuck stepped out with a friendly grin. He motioned for Jeremy to follow him into a small recording booth. The environment was hushed, the walls padded to capture every nuance of sound. Several professionals lingered behind an observation window. They introduced themselves as producers, songwriters, or industry scouts. Jeremy's throat felt parched, but he forced himself to breathe steadily. Chuck urged him to play something original. Jeremy cleared his throat and began strumming a simple chord progression, letting his voice flow from a place of deep longing. The lyrics came out like a confession, revealing heartbreak, resilience, and a glimmer of hope. The producers exchanged intrigued looks. Chuck nodded slowly, arms folded across his chest. When Jeremy finished, the room was silent except for the hum of the air conditioner. Then one producer spoke up, praising the honesty in Jeremy's voice. Another commented on the richness of his tone. Chuck simply gave Jeremy an encouraging pat on the back, asking him to stay a bit longer. Jeremy ended up playing 3 more songs, each one exposing a different shade of his life's struggle. The small audience listened intently. They discussed the potential for refining these raw songs, shaping them into something that could resonate widely. Jeremy felt overwhelmed, yet he managed a wavering smile. He had never played in a real recording booth before, and the experience felt surreal. He kept thinking back to the day Chuck halted traffic just to listen to him. He couldn't quite believe that moment had led here, to an actual studio. Therefore, the producers invited Jeremy to schedule a demo session. They wanted to test how his vocals would sound under professional engineering. Jeremy could hardly find the words to thank them, so he simply bowed his head in gratitude. He glanced at Chuck, who nodded, letting him know this was exactly where he belonged. Once the meeting concluded, Chuck and Jeremy stepped outside into the bright afternoon sun. Jeremy's hands still trembled, but his eyes shone with possibilities he had never dared to imagine. Chuck asked him about his background, curious to learn more than the glimpses Jeremy had shared on that sidewalk. Jeremy spoke of a childhood in a small, impoverished town. He recalled the father who left early, the mother who did her best to keep food on the table, and the battered guitar that became his sanctuary. He spent countless nights strumming chords beneath flickering streetlights, dreaming of big stages he only saw on TV. Over time, harsh realities forced him onto the streets, but he always carried his music wherever he went. Chuck listened carefully, occasionally nodding in empathy. He believed Jeremy's story held an essential sincerity that the music industry often lacked. Yet Chuck also knew that real success required more than raw talent. It demanded perseverance, discipline, and a little guidance from people who saw the bigger picture. Therefore, Chuck vowed to stand by Jeremy, at least until he found stable footing. In the days that followed, Jeremy returned to the studio for a preliminary recording session. He marveled at the equipment, stepping inside a high-tech recording room that felt worlds apart from the noisy sidewalks where he once performed. Professional sound engineers tweaked levels while Jeremy sang into a microphone worth more than all his worldly possessions combined. His voice vibrated through expensive headphones, and for the first time, he heard a crisp echo of his own potential. But he struggled with self-doubt. He kept second-guessing himself, stopping mid-verse, apologizing for small mistakes. The producer calmly reassured him that this was part of the process, but Jeremy's cheeks burned with embarrassment. He had never realized how nerve-wracking it would feel to belt out his soul in such a clinical environment. Chuck showed up unannounced partway through the session, giving Jeremy a supportive nod from behind the glass. That single gesture steadied Jeremy's breath. He finished the session with a tender ballad that made the sound engineer look up in quiet awe. The final note hung in the studio air, raw and honest. Once they wrapped up, Chuck guided Jeremy to a small lounge area where they could decompress. Jeremy worried that he might be out of his depth, but Chuck reminded him that every professional started somewhere. He encouraged Jeremy to believe in his talent. Jeremy exhaled shakily, aware that Chuck's faith in him was more than he had ever dared hope for. The next day, the producers gathered to review the recorded tracks. They were impressed enough to suggest fine-tuning a couple of Jeremy's original compositions. A plan emerged to potentially include Jeremy in an upcoming showcase night where industry executives scouted fresh talent. Jeremy felt both excitement and terror swirling inside him. He had never performed for more than a handful of passing strangers at a time. Chuck recognized that fear in Jeremy's eyes and offered to help him prepare. Therefore, Chuck arranged for a small practice venue in the back of an old community center, inviting a few trusted friends to act as a supportive audience. Jeremy stood on a makeshift stage with cheap lighting, strumming his guitar as Chuck looked on. The first song wavered with nerves, but halfway through, Jeremy remembered how it felt to sing on the street corner with unfiltered emotion. He let himself sink into that raw place again, ignoring the setting, ignoring his own fear. The handful of onlookers clapped enthusiastically. Jeremy ended up doing 3 songs, each performance building confidence he never knew he possessed. Chuck pulled him aside and noted that while Jeremy lacked formal training, the genuine passion in his voice was something that couldn't be faked. Jeremy nodded, cheeks flushed. He had never been praised like this, not in a place where people understood music's power. Chuck reminded him that vulnerability was strength. He told Jeremy that the real magic lay in opening his heart through each note, letting an audience see the scars and the triumphs. Jeremy blinked back tears, moved by Chuck's words. Therefore, they continued rehearsing. In between songs, Chuck offered pointers on stage presence, gleaned from his years of public appearances. He showed Jeremy how to carry himself with quiet confidence, how to engage the crowd with eye contact, how to let each pause linger just enough to build suspense. Jeremy soaked in every word, determined to do justice to the extraordinary faith Chuck had placed in him. As the showcase date drew near, Jeremy faced an unexpected complication. The old motel he called home went under new management, and the owners insisted that he settle overdue fees or leave. Jeremy panicked because he barely had enough to cover daily meals, and the studio work left little time to earn tips on the street. Chuck caught wind of the situation and quietly covered Jeremy's outstanding debt, insisting it was just a short-term measure. Jeremy resisted at first, overwhelmed by gratitude but also prideful. Chuck calmly explained that every dreamer deserved a chance to flourish before life's harsh realities could snatch hope away. Jeremy finally accepted, wiping away tears he tried to hide. He promised Chuck that he wouldn't let him down. Then the night of the showcase arrived, and Jeremy stood backstage at a local music venue that had once hosted emerging bands on their climb to stardom. Industry insiders mingled in the dimly lit room, sipping cocktails and scanning the setlist for any new talent. Jeremy felt his stomach churn at the thought of performing before these strangers who might decide his fate with a single glance. Chuck found him pacing in the wings, pale and breathing rapidly. He placed a comforting hand on Jeremy's shoulder, reminding him why he was there. Chuck told him to forget about the suits in the crowd. He said to focus on the music, on the reason he first picked up a guitar, on all the nights he spent under the stars playing to nobody in particular. Jeremy nodded, inhaled a steadying breath, and stepped on stage as the lights dimmed. He opened with a stripped-down ballad, letting his voice rise above the soft strums of his guitar. A hush fell over the audience. Even the usual clinking of glasses ceased as people realized something special was happening. Jeremy's voice cracked at a raw emotional peak, yet that imperfection only added authenticity. By the end of that first song, scattered applause erupted, growing louder as more onlookers realized they were witnessing a unique talent. For his second number, Jeremy picked up the tempo slightly, tapping into the hopeful undertones of his story. He caught sight of Chuck's encouraging nod from the side of the stage. He rode that confidence, letting his emotions shine through every lyric. When he finished, an industry executive near the bar leaned over to a colleague, whispering that he hadn't heard such unrefined yet potent energy in years. The applause rained down in an unrelenting wave. Jeremy blinked in shock, bowing his head in modest gratitude. He exited the stage to cheers that echoed in his heart. Chuck was waiting, patting him on the back. The rest of the showcase passed in a blur for Jeremy. Several executives approached him, praising his performance. One slid him a business card, hinting at the potential for a development deal. Another suggested collaborating with a seasoned songwriter. Jeremy felt dizzy, hearing compliments he never dreamed possible. Chuck escorted him outside, away from the chaos, letting him breathe in the cool night air. Jeremy stared at the sky, trying to process the sudden shift in his life. He had come from playing on street corners for a few coins to drawing genuine interest from major players in the music scene. He looked at Chuck, struggling to find words big enough to convey his gratitude. Chuck shrugged, explaining that he only recognized what was already there. He told Jeremy that true artistry sometimes just needed the right moment and a helping hand. Their conversation was interrupted by a flurry of well-wishers emerging from the venue. They congratulated Jeremy, some even offering to buy him a drink. He accepted humbly but kept glancing at Chuck, who remained in the background, letting Jeremy enjoy the spotlight he had earned. Over the next few weeks, Jeremy found himself fielding phone calls from various music professionals who wanted to set up meetings. He recorded additional demos, refining a mix of old songs and newly inspired pieces. His voice began showing more range and depth now that he had access to better tools and guidance. Still, he never lost the raw edge that made his music so hauntingly authentic. Chuck continued to check in on him, making sure he stayed grounded. But Chuck knew that success in the entertainment world could be fleeting or full of pitfalls. He told Jeremy not to sign anything without proper legal advice. He introduced him to a reputable lawyer who specialized in entertainment contracts, cautioning him about the dangers of shady deals that could trap him in a cycle of debt. Jeremy absorbed every lesson like a thirsty plant under sunshine. At one point, a producer proposed an elaborate scheme to rebrand Jeremy with a flashy image, complete with stylized outfits and choreographed stage moves that bore no resemblance to his natural style. Jeremy felt torn, seduced by the promise of quick fame but wary of losing himself in the process. He asked Chuck for advice. Chuck reminded him that authenticity was his greatest weapon. If he succumbed to a marketing facade, the raw emotion that people connected with would vanish. Therefore, Jeremy politely declined that particular offer, choosing to trust the slow burn of genuine evolution over the hollow glimmer of immediate hype. Soon, a promising partnership emerged with a respected indie label that prided itself on nurturing authentic voices. They offered Jeremy a contract that recognized his creative control and provided gradual financial support for better living conditions and professional production. The label's representative, a kind-hearted woman named Maria, explained that they believed in letting an artist's story shine through, and Jeremy's story was undeniably powerful. Jeremy asked Chuck to accompany him when he went to sign the papers. Chuck sat quietly in the corner, letting the label's team handle the details, only speaking up to clarify certain clauses. He wanted to ensure that Jeremy wouldn't be exploited. When it was all over, Jeremy had a signed agreement in hand, along with a small advance that would allow him to move out of his crumbling motel. He blinked in astonishment, unsure how his life had flipped from street corners to a legitimate record deal in such a short span. Maria told him that sometimes destiny needed a push from an unexpected source. Chuck simply smiled, staying as humble as ever. Meanwhile, the viral video of Chuck stopping traffic continued to circulate online, though it was slowly overshadowed by more recent stories. Some new fans discovered Jeremy through that clip, commenting that they found his music because Chuck Norris noticed him first. Jeremy's social media presence expanded, albeit gradually. He posted short acoustic performances filmed in his modest new apartment, giving thanks to the random passers-by who once tossed loose change at his feet. A swirl of new supporters encouraged him to chase his dream wholeheartedly. Weeks turned into months, and Jeremy found himself deep in the process of recording a debut EP under the guidance of the indie label. He was nervous but excited about every track, striving to capture the spirit of what made Chuck stop that day. He wanted the music to hold the same magnetism that compelled a movie legend to freeze city traffic. Late nights in the studio blurred with early mornings scribbling new lyrics. Chuck visited every so often, never overstepping, simply offering a steadying presence. Jeremy occasionally texted him raw snippets of new songs, asking for an honest opinion. Chuck always responded with thoughtful notes, praising the authenticity while suggesting minor adjustments to keep the emotional core intact. Soon, the label arranged a small promotional tour through nearby cities, letting Jeremy and a few other emerging artists share their music with intimate audiences. Jeremy hopped on a worn tour bus with his guitar, feeling adrenaline mixed with a touch of homesickness for the gritty street corners that once defined his existence. But he poured his heart into every performance, forging real connections with listeners who heard echoes of their own struggles in his songs. Word began to spread. Critics described him as an unpolished force of nature, a voice that cut to the bone. Jeremy blushed at the attention, mindful that success could evaporate just as easily as it arrived. But he also felt a spark of pride, knowing that he had come this far without compromising his essence. Finally, the day arrived for Jeremy's EP release. The label hosted a modest launch party in a cozy venue, inviting close friends, family, and industry folks. Jeremy stepped on stage to raucous applause, scanning the crowd until he spotted Chuck standing in the back, half hidden behind the swirling lights. He felt a wave of gratitude crash over him. With trembling fingers, he strummed the opening chords of a track called City Stopped, written about the fateful moment when Chuck halted traffic to hear him play. The audience listened spellbound, and Chuck nodded in quiet approval. After the show, Jeremy made a beeline for Chuck. They stood under the flickering neon sign outside, a hush wrapping around them. Jeremy tried to thank him, but Chuck simply shook his head, reminding him that the talent was always there. He said all he did was notice, which was something everyone else failed to do. Jeremy's eyes stung with tears, remembering the countless days he played his heart out for busy strangers who never stopped. He told Chuck that he had no idea how to ever repay the kindness. Chuck replied that by sharing his gift with the world, Jeremy was already giving back. Therefore, the story made its way into local news segments again. Reporters interviewed Jeremy and pressed him about how he felt receiving that cosmic stroke of luck. He told them luck was part of it, but so was the readiness to seize the moment when it came. He recounted how Chuck's calm reassurance convinced him to keep pushing, even when the music industry seemed too complex for someone with no formal training. The public adored the narrative, a humble street performer plucked from obscurity by an unlikely hero, forging a path toward success without losing his soul. As Jeremy's EP gained traction on streaming platforms, messages of support poured in. Young musicians thanked him for showing that raw passion could catch the attention of powerful allies. Others just loved the authenticity and heartbreak in his lyrics. A few casual listeners became loyal fans, enthralled by the honesty that bled through every chord. The label began planning a full-length album. There was even talk of booking Jeremy on a small national tour if his fanbase continued to grow. Through it all, Jeremy stayed in contact with Chuck, not in a daily sense, but enough to keep him updated on how quickly his life was evolving. Chuck always congratulated him, reminding him to keep his head on straight, to never forget where he came from, and to guard the spark that made him stand out in the first place. One day, Chuck happened to be driving near that same avenue where it all began. He noticed a young woman singing with a cheap keyboard. Cars rushed past her as though she didn't exist. For a moment, Chuck felt an echo of that old impulse to slam on the brakes and listen. He did pull over briefly, dropping a bill into her open case before carrying on. He wondered how many more hidden talents were scattered along sidewalks and